I wasn't prioritizing off-roading and building things and fabricating, and I was just getting burnt out. I thought it might be helpful to just give a little background for anybody who wants to know a little more about me as I start this channel. Basically my story and how I got into off-roading and Jeeps and my Land Cruiser, which I'm currently driving in. So yeah, I think I start at the beginning. I grew up in New England, New Hampshire actually, and I had a friend whose father was a mechanic. He worked for, I think it was a telephone company, and he was like the fleet mechanic. He maintained all the trucks and everything. With those skills and background, he ended up buying a Jeep. He bought a YJ, and it was about as cheap as he could get. It was a 4-cylinder, I think it was a 5-speed, and it was, you know, bone stock, and decided just completely to rip it apart and build a Jeep. He pulls up in this thing, and you could hear it coming, and it just sounded awesome. This Jeep with a big old V8 small block Chevy, and man, it was awesome. I just loved it. So he took me for a spin around the area, and then they invited me on a trip. And so I was probably like 13 or 14, and I'm 36 now. I was just enamored. I just thought this was the coolest thing. We went on a weekend trip, and I remember he would wheel this thing so hard. He didn't modify the axles. This was before, you know, the time when people were swapping in. Well, people were, but at least this guy wasn't. Get a little quieter in here. He had stock axles. I don't know if he was running on a Dana 30 and like a Dana 35 in the rear or something, but he was blowing up axles. So I remember we were going up trail and came up to a tough spot. He tried a couple of times to kind of crawl it, and then he just floored the thing. He sure enough broke a rear axle. No big deal. He kind of backed off to the side of the trail. The other guys in the club went by him. He proceeded to pull out his air gun, and he hooked it in to the bumper, front bumper, which was his tank, and he had the engine running, and boom, he was pulling off the axle. He pulled it out, pulled the piece out. He must have had a Dana 44 in there because he was able to drive it down in 3-wheel drive, so it had to have been a Dana 44. I just loved it. I thought this was the most amazing thing, being able to build this himself, and so that's how I got hooked. That's how I started getting into it, and ever since then, I have gone through so many different vehicles. So initially my first rig was, man, it was like an 88 or something Ford Bronco 2. It was an Eddie Bauer edition, and the thing was like gutless, and I'm pretty sure the tranny was going out on it because I remember having to add tranny fluid. It was an automatic. It would like slip out of the gear and stuff. It was kind of a turd, but I thought it was awesome because it was as close to a Jeep as I could afford. And then from there, I got into bikes for a little while. I had a couple of motorcycles, and then I drove this cheap little car, Dodge Omni, and that thing served me well. I had so many miles on that thing. I proposed to my wife in that car, and I eventually brought it to a junkyard and gave it to him for scrap, and I got like $200 for it when I bought it for like $400 from like an old grandma. So anyway, that was that. And then finally, when I got my first my first Jeep, I got a Cherokee. It was a 99 Jeep Cherokee Sport, and I started to modify it. This is where I first started to get into welding. Actually, I take that back. My first rig was actually a 4Runner. It was a 2001 4Runner Limited. It had a locking differential in the rear. Actually, man, I take that back again. I got to start this over. Man, I can't even keep straight how many vehicles I've had. So the first one was a Toyota Tacoma. It was a single cab Toyota Tacoma. I used it as a daily driver. I didn't modify it really at all, and I never got a chance to take it off-road. It was a 4x4, but it just didn't, I was so busy with a brand new job, my first job out of college. I just drove it to work and back every day, and I was working a ton of hours, and about as close as I could get to off-roading was I would stay late on the job site, and I would go out on the site to make sure gates were closed and stuff, and I'd drive over the, dirt piles. That was about it. And so it was kind of depressing. I did some like small mods and put like a tow hitch on it. Anyway, I eventually got rid of that, and I bought a 4Runner. It was a 2001 4Runner Limited, had a locking rear differential from the factory, and I bought it bone stock, and I modified. That was the first one that I really started modifying. I bought a lift kit from Toy Tech It wasn't too big. It was like 2 or 3 inches. Independent front suspension. I couldn't go too high. I would kill the CVs. I put bigger tires on it, but it was not big, very big. It was like, I think they're like 32s or so. And it was a pretty non-aggressive tire. It was basically a street tire, really. They're Michelin LTXs, if you remember those. M&S for mud and snow. And I took that off-road for the first time, pretty much in that condition, and it was a snow run in Wisconsin. I think some of that footage is still online, and I just got stuck like you wouldn't believe. Like, the whole compilation that they put together, 80% of the stuck was me. That was my first experience of my own rig that I had started lifting. I eventually put it on 33s. I put a body lift on it to clear those. It was a good rig. It was really good, but I was itching for more. I wanted to do something a little more extreme, have a solid front axle. So that's when I got rid of that. I found a Rubicon. It was a TJ Rubicon, and I paid a pretty penny for it, even in, you know, being in a used condition. And I bought it when the lockers didn't work. It was the air actuated. Anyway, I got it to work, and I wheeled that once. I had spent all my money upgrading to this thing, and I found that I didn't want to just have a rig that was already modified. Plus, I couldn't afford to do anything else. I already had the lockers front and rear and everything, but I couldn't do anything else. So that's when I decided I'm going to move to a cheaper, less expensive base to start with, and that's when I got into my Cherokee. I bought it pretty cheap, and I had sold the Rubicon, so now I had a little pool of money to play with. Not a ton, given we were starting our family. It was hard to find time to get into the garage. I would go out on the weekends and at night after my wife was in bed, and I would work late into the night, and then I'd get up, go to work the next day, and you know, it's just what you got to do. And I do that to get ready for different off-roading events. So I put a lift on it. I piecemealed it together from Iron Rock Off-Road. Great organization, by the way. They're a great company, really good products. I basically pieced a kit together from old either returned or whatever it was, parts and pieces that they had. It was probably about a 6-inch lift all said and done, between the shackles and the lift springs and the leaf packs. Dana 30 stock gears, and then the Chrysler 8 1/4 in the back, stock gears. And I put 35s on it. I found 35s cheap on Craigslist that a guy was taking off of a Wrangler, and that was my rig and setup. Then what I really started getting excited about, I needed to have recovery points, and I couldn't afford bumpers. I didn't have the skills or anything to fabricate bumpers. I bought a cheap welder to learn how to weld. It was a Hobart Handler 140. So that ran off of my typical wall outlet 110, and I couldn't do a lot with it, but I learned. I taught myself how to weld. And it just opened up this whole door for me. It just really made me excited about being able to modify my machine and be able to turn it into something that I wanted. Then I sold the 140 and I bought a 187, the Hobart Handler 187, which is what my first video was using. I built recovery points. Basically, I bought some tube steel. I fabbed up some brackets to tie back into the unibody of the Cherokee. I pulled the bumper off and the front clip and everything, and then I built this kind of bracket that tied the two together. Basically, I was trying to copy what you could buy, but I couldn't afford. And I fabbed this thing up, and then I put recovery hooks on it. I didn't have a winch, or I couldn't afford a winch, couldn't do any of that, but I put these recovery hooks in, and then I took the old bumper and I put it over top. I'll put in some pictures here so you can see what it looks like. But that worked great. I did that on the front and the rear, and I was like, I was so proud of myself. Like, I went out on my first run with this thing, and I was just, you know, I was open diffs front and rear. I eventually put True Track or Spartan. I think I used Spartan front and rear lockers for that because I was just getting stuck out in the woods. And man, that rig was a good rig. It did really well. I got into some hairy situations. I blew out the back windows. I was able to replace those with some glass I found on Craigslist. That was like my go-to. It still is, really. And yeah, it was a good rig. I eventually decided I needed to move on from that. I was really interested in getting an old CJ. I wanted to get back into kind of a real trail rig. There was an old CJ that I found. It was a CJ7, 83 or 84, and it was painted up and made to look like a Golden Eagle. I bought it relatively cheap because the engine, the 258, had a knock. And it was It was bad, but it wasn't bad enough that you couldn't drive it. I put in some heavier weight oil and I drove it, and I ended up rebuilding the engine. Now that was a great experience too, just to learn about how to do that sort of a thing. So I ripped the thing up. I did a ton of research. I bought like the technical manuals. I had all the information I needed, and I'd watched a ton of videos. And for an engine to start on in terms of a rebuild, the straight six 258 was about as straightforward as you can get. So I tore it all apart in my garage myself. I bought a hoist, again on Craigslist. I bought an engine stand. I pulled the thing apart, got it down to the block, and I found a local shop out there, brought it in. They cleaned it up, honed it out, and then I asked them to, once they honed it out and everything, to buy the pistons and everything that I needed of that size and the rings and all that. And then I assembled it in my garage, and it was the coolest thing. The night, I remember still, I got the video, I'll have to show it, put a clip in here. But when I started and turned that thing over the first time, it actually fired up. Broke it in, and it was awesome. But it got to the point where I took another job and decided I was going to move the family to California. Moving to California meant emissions and smog. Even though I just rebuilt this engine, it was burning, clean and all this stuff. I had an aftermarket carburetor on there, and then I didn't have all the smog stuff. This was from '83, and that had all been gone long ago. So there was no way that it was going to pass emissions in California, and I had to get rid of it. My family was growing as well. I've got 4 kids now, just had our 4th, and at the time we had 3, and another one on the way. And I decided, if we're going to move to California anyway, and I got to get rid of this, I got to look for a rig that I can fit my family in. At the time, 3 kids. And so I decided to sell it, and I sold it before I left, and moved to California. Man, I can't even keep straight how many vehicles I've had. Out for the next vehicle. That ended up being, I went back to the Cherokee. I bought another '99 Cherokee Sport. This time it was a blue one. The first one was a black one. And now I said, look, I was actually looking at the time for a Land Cruiser, but I could not find one for under 12 grand or something. And all of them had like 250,000 miles on them, and they're still asking like 15 grand or 12 grand or whatever. And so I got, I didn't want to run into the situation I did with the Rubicon, where I spent all my money on the vehicle and then I can't afford to do anything to it. So I found a Cherokee for relatively cheap. It had low miles, like 137,000 miles or 134,000 miles, something like that. And I stripped this thing down and built it up. I did a lift kit initially from Iron Rock Off-Road. It was an 8-inch long-arm lift. I ran 35s on it. I had sway bar disconnects. I had front and rear bumpers. Ultimately, I wanted to put a Dana 44 in the front. I didn't want to re-gear the stock axles. When I found on Craigslist in Lake Havasu a guy that was selling an old Cherokee that was on 44s. It was a pretty beat up rig, but it was on 44s already. Dana 44s, sorry, not 44-inch wheels or tires. Dana 44s, front and rear. It had been re-geared to 456. It had a winch on the front. It ended up getting stolen before I bought it, which kind of sucked because I already had a winch. But basically what I did is I found this rig. It had hydraulic steering on it, the Dana 44s, the re-gear, everything. And so I pulled everything off of it that I wanted. It had the body armor, if you remember, like from Rusty's Off-Road, the body armor all the way around. Some of it he hadn't even installed yet. Anyway, I bought this thing. I flat towed it back from Lake Havasu. It took me 4 hours to get there from Southern California, and it took me 8 hours to get back because the thing had death wobble like crazy even when I was pulling it behind my rig. My rig wasn't as good either. I had upgraded my steering, but it was still pretty sketchy. So I couldn't go over like 40 miles an hour, and you're not supposed to flat tow a vehicle of the same size. So it was sketchy at best. And I made it home. I ended up parting that thing out completely. And not only did I get all the parts and pieces off of it, but I bought it for like $6,000, and I parted it out for what came to like $5,500. So I basically for $500, I got I got a Dana 44 front and rear, re-geared. Both had lockers in them, E-lockers, which worked. I got hydraulic steering. I got a whole bunch of stuff. It was like by far the best investment I had ever made. It took me a while to part it out, and my wife, bless her heart, had to deal with me with this Jeep in the garage. Then I had to get rid of the body when I'd ripped everything else out of it. But it was awesome. It was like a great learning experience. I saved a ton of money, and then I built up my rig even more. Then baby number 4 came along, or my wife got pregnant, baby number 4. Now this is like the last. I got 2 girls, 2 boys, but it was like, okay, reality sets in. I have these goals to be able to take my family out to the Rubicon in my rig, go to Utah, go to Moab. That's like my vision for this channel, is to not only do the work, but then show you these trips that you can take with your family, and how much fun it is, and getting off road and everything. I realized that unless I was going to go down the road, which I did consider going down the road of buying a tow rig. We have a minivan for our other vehicle. That's not going to tow a rig. And then I would, even still, I don't have enough seatbelts for everybody. I had to make the tough decision of what am I going to do. I think I'm going to have to get rid of this Cherokee. And so I started looking again for a Land Cruiser. Instead of trying to sell my Cherokee built, I had learned that from parting out that other Cherokee, I could make my money back and make more money, actually, by parting this out. Because it's built, not bought, right? You don't want to buy a full-blown rig. Some guys do, and that's great. I'm totally fine with that. But for me, at least my personality is, I want to build it myself. I want to find the parts and pieces and put it together, and that's part of the fun. So I decided to part out my 99 Cherokee with all the Dana 44s and front and rear and everything like that. So I did. It took me a little over a month to do, just between work and all that stuff, having the time to do it. But I made my money back and then some. And so now I had this pool of money to find a Land Cruiser. So I found the Land Cruiser before I parted it out, because I still needed a vehicle to drive day to day. I found a 94 Land Cruiser. Now I got a steal of a deal on this thing. One owner, it has lockers from the factory. It's in decent shape. I mean, it's a 94, so the leather is torn up in the seats, front seats. The rear and the third row are decent. It's not amazing, but it's not terrible. It runs okay. It's got a check engine light that's intermittent. I think I know what it is. I got to pull off the intake and clean it out and that sort of a thing. It runs decent though. So I found this, I parted out the Jeep, and now I'm ready to start building the Land Cruiser. And that's when I thought, if I'm ever gonna make a YouTube channel, now's the time, because I'm starting at the beginning of this project. So here we are. I gotta fit this in somehow. So I've developed a routine. Hopefully I can stick with it and get these videos out on a relatively regular basis. I'd love to hear your comments and your feedback, things that you're looking for. There's so many more people out there that know more about Land Cruisers than I do. I'm just getting into this. So anything you have to share, I'd be happy to learn. What I've found, and one of the reasons I decided to do this, is there's a ton of information on Jeeps and off-roading with Jeeps and stuff, but Land Cruiser specific, there's a few really good channels that I found, but there's not a ton. And so I feel like there's an opportunity to do like a full-on detailed ground-up type build and document it with videos. I feel like there's enough following for Land Cruisers that would be cool. So that's what I'm gonna do. That's what my intent is for this channel. And then from there, once I build the Land Cruiser, I'm gonna document some of these trips that I'm planning on taking with my family, taking this thing to Moab, going to the Rubicon Trail, and seeing what you'll do. Like, I'm just super excited to do that. I was just finding that I got to this spot in my life where I wasn't prioritizing this, the passion around off-roading and building things and fabricating, and I was just getting burnt out. And so I said, if I'm ever gonna do it, now's the time, because before you know it, my kids are gonna be grown up. I'm gonna be, you can waste your life away working every day. It's just, you have to support your family, especially living in California, as expensive as it is. But why not try to do something that you enjoy? I got up at 5 a.m. this morning to start editing a couple of videos that I'm trying to get out, and man, I tell you, I have a hard enough time getting up in general because I'm usually up late. I'm kind of a night owl. But this morning the alarm went off and I popped out of bed. I was excited to work on these videos. Tell me what you're interested in. Tell me what I'm doing wrong. Tell me what I can do better. I'm just beginning, so feedback is great. I'll welcome it, good and bad. And that's it. So this is Matt. Again, thanks. Welcome to my channel. Apologize for this kind of a long rant, but hopefully you find it interesting or somebody does. And now you know me a little bit better as I start sharing these videos with you. So that's it. Get out there, do something today that gets you outside.